You know, business can be a cutthroat game, right? But some people don't just play hard, they play dirty. From Wall Street to crypto to Silicon Valley, there's no shortage of people who are not the geniuses they claim to be, but some of them are so good at selling their story, you don't even notice their lies until they end up in jail. Today we're diving into the stories of 5 business titans whose success was nothing more than an elaborate scam and how everything they built finally came crashing down. Welcome to Alux, the place where future billionaires come to get inspired. Alright, so we're going to start off today on Wall Street. Now, Wall Street's always been a loud place, right? But in the early 90s, one guy stood out for all the wrong reasons. Jordan Belfort, or better known as the Wolf of Wall Street. Spoiler alert. Now, Jordan didn't initially set out to become some kind of criminal mastermind. His first job was as a trainee stockbroker at a prestigious Wall Street firm. For a guy fresh out of college, this was the big leagues, but as Jordan was starting out, a market crash sent shockwaves through Wall Street and he found himself without a job. Now, this would be the end of the story for most people, but Jordan was determined to make it here, so he pivoted to trading over-the-counter stocks. Now, these kinds of stocks aren't listed on major exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange. Instead, they're traded directly between parties with little oversight or regulation. Think of it as the Wild West of finance. It was a world away from Wall Street, but Jordan was desperate for money. The thing is, though, what he really found was a gold mine. You see, back in the 80s, stockbrokers used to earn commissions every time they made trades on their clients' behalf. At Jordan's old Wall Street firm, these commissions were tiny because they were tied to big established companies. But in the over-the-counter world, it was the complete opposite. If someone agreed to buy $10,000 worth of a stock, well, Jordan could get up to $5,000 in commissions. It didn't even matter if the stock was valuable. All that mattered was getting someone to buy it. Jordan realized the money here wasn't in investing, it was in selling, and he was a remarkable salesman. That's when Stratton Oakmont was born, a brokerage firm with the singular purpose of exploiting this loophole. At its core was Jordan's army of brokers, but these weren't seasoned investment professionals. They were hungry salespeople who followed Jordan's golden rule: sell the dream, not the stock. Behind the scenes, the real scheme was unfolding, though. Stratton Oakmont didn't just sell stocks, it manipulated them. Jordan would target a cheap, obscure, often struggling company and get a bunch of people outside the firm to quietly buy a bunch of their stock for him. Now, this artificial demand would drive up the price, making it look like the stock was a hot commodity. When Jordan's brokers started making money, convincing everyday people to spend their life savings was easy. They would talk about massive potential and explosive growth, anything to keep that frenzy alive. And when the time was right, Jordan and his insiders would pull the rug out and sell all of their stock at the inflated price. The stock's value would collapse, leaving investors with nothing while Jordan walked away with millions. It was a textbook pump-and-dump scheme, but Jordan took it to unprecedented heights. While Stratton Oakmont defrauded investors of over $200 million, their office parties made Vegas look tame. Employees were rewarded with cash, cars, even drugs. But with every scheme, the stakes grew higher. Eventually, Stratton Oakmont started taking companies public, which brought even more money, but it also raised some regulatory eyebrows, and by the late 90s, the jig was up. The FBI raided Stratton Oakmont, and Jordan was charged with securities fraud and money laundering. In 1999, he was sentenced to 22 months in prison, a surprisingly light punishment for the damage he caused. But even jail couldn't dim his charisma. Once he was out, Jordan reinvented himself as a motivational speaker and author, which led to the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. It basically turned him into a celebrity, but Jordan's reputation will always be tied to his crimes. So let's not get distracted from the lesson here, okay? Lies and greed might bring you short-term success, but reputation? Well, that's a long-term game. Alright, so moving on. If you thought that Wall Street was filled with frauds, just wait until we get into crypto, okay? Our next story is about a young, nerdy, would-be genius by the name of Sam Bankman-Fried. In just a few short years, he went from being crypto's poster child to the face of one of the largest financial scandals in history. So it all started back in 2014 when, fresh out of MIT, Sam landed a job at a respected trading firm. Cryptocurrencies were just starting to gain attention, and Sam discovered that he could buy Bitcoin cheaply in the US and sell it for higher prices in Japan. And the margins weren't just good, okay, they were extraordinary. But in 2017, Sam decided it was time to branch out on his own. So using his Bitcoin profits, he founded Alameda Research, a crypto trading firm that promised jaw-dropping returns. So Sam told the press and his investors that his goal wasn't to get rich. His beat-up Toyota Corolla and his wardrobe of shorts and hoodies painted the picture of a humble, selfless billionaire. And Sam often said he was amassing wealth because one day he would give everything away. And it worked. In 2019, Sam launched FTX, a cryptocurrency exchange that he marketed as the safe and most reliable platform in this space. Its meteoric rise was staggering. The platform secured $2 billion in investments from major players like BlackRock and SoftBank, and within 3 years, FTX was processing $10 billion in trades daily with over 1 million users. Sam spared no expense on marketing either. FTX landed celebrity endorsements from Tom Brady, Steph Curry, and Larry David. They sponsored everything from a stadium in Miami to basketball and Formula One teams. And social media influencers across the globe promoted FTX as the safest, most reliable crypto exchange. For a while, the strategy worked. FTX looked like a legitimate, world-class company, and Sam's image as a humble genius kept doubts at bay. But then, FTX introduced its own cryptocurrency, the FTT token. Now, on paper, FTT was a simple loyalty token offering users discounts and rewards, but in reality, it was the backbone of a massive fraud. Remember Alameda Research? Well, it was losing boatloads of money, and Sam was using FTT as collateral to secure loans, essentially printing his own money to cover massive losses. And worse, billions of dollars in customer funds were secretly funneled from FTX to Alameda Research. It was a shameless fraud. Everything started to fall apart in November 2022 when a leaked report revealed that a bunch of Alameda's $14.6 billion in assets was tied up in FTT. That's when the CEO of Binance, FTX's biggest competitor, publicly announced that he would sell $2 billion worth of FTT. When the public heard this, it triggered a panic. Sam tried to reassure everyone, but the math just didn't add up. FTX only had $900 million in customer funds when it was supposed to be holding $9 billion. Basically, there was an $8 billion hole in the company's finances. When thousands of people started to withdraw their money, they simply didn't have it. Days later, FTX and Alameda Research both filed for bankruptcy, and over $1 billion in customer funds mysteriously disappeared. Sam, who was once worth $26 billion, was broke and under house arrest in the Bahamas. In 2023, he was extradited to the US, where he faced charges of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. By the end of the year, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. So the lesson here is pretty simple, okay? If someone tells you that one day they're gonna give away all of their billions, just take that with a grain of salt, all right? But you know, when it comes to financial fraud, nothing beats a good old-fashioned Ponzi scheme, and Bernie Madoff orchestrated the largest one in history. Now, Madoff was once considered to be one of the most brilliant minds in finance. He started his investment firm in 1960 with $5,000 he earned as a lifeguard and a $50,000 loan from his father-in-law. At a time when most people were still shouting orders on trading floors, Madoff embraced electronic trading, which let him undercut his competitors and dominate the market. By the 1980s, his firm was handling up to 10% of all trades on the New York Stock Exchange, which is kind of crazy to think about. But Madoff's reputation in Wall Street was even crazier. As the chairman of the NASDAQ exchange, he became known as a financial genius, and his clients weren't just rich, they were billionaires, celebrities, and charitable foundations. To invest with Madoff wasn't just about money, it was about status. But in the early 1990s, Bernie's brokerage firm started struggling to deliver the kinds of returns investors expected, and this put his whole reputation at risk. But instead of admitting failure, Madoff decided to fake his success with a classic Ponzi scheme. So here's how it works. Ponzi schemes are just about shuffling money around. When new investors come on board, instead of actually investing their money, you give it to earlier investors as their quote-unquote returns. On paper, it looks like everyone's making a fortune, but you're basically just robbing Peter to pay Paul and then robbing Patrick to pay Peter. Madoff's Ponzi scheme was really that simple, but what made it work was the secrecy. This new firm operated out of a separate floor in Madoff's New York office, and it was off limits, even to his family, who worked at his legitimate brokerage. To his investors, he promised steady, almost magical returns courtesy of his split-strike conversion strategy, which sounded sophisticated but was entirely fake. But instead of getting suspicious, everyone thought, well, this is Bernie Madoff, of course we can trust him. Plus, his clients weren't just anyone. They were a private elite group that people wanted to be in. If you questioned him, it meant you didn't belong. By the early 2000s, Madoff claimed that his firm was managing an astounding $65 billion. But the truth is, he had just a tiny fraction of that because the scam depended on new clients coming in to pay the old ones. And then came 2008. The global financial crisis hit hard, and suddenly investors wanted billions of dollars back. Madoff's house of cards began to collapse because he didn't have the cash to cover withdrawals. In a desperate moment, Madoff confessed everything to his sons, hoping they would help him to hold it together, but instead, they turned him in. In December 2008, Bernie Madoff was arrested and history's largest Ponzi scheme was exposed. Thousands of victims, from retirees to billionaires, lost everything. Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in prison, where he spent the rest of his life. So remember, okay, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. But let me just ask you a question here, okay? How do you make sure you don't fall for the next Jordan Belfort, Sam Bankman-Fried, or Bernie Madoff? Or better yet, how do you build your wealth the right way without having to swindle anybody? Well, the truth is, it takes a long-term mindset, but that's exactly why we built the Alux app. When you sign up, you tell us where you are right now and what your goals are, and based on that, our app's algorithm builds you a personalized growth path. On each step along the way, you get practical lessons, tools, and expert courses with business strategies that actually work. No Ponzi schemes or investor scams required. Plus, you get daily insights about how to improve in every aspect of your life, from your wealth to your physical fitness and even your relationships. So whether you're setting financial goals, building better habits, or just trying to figure out if someone is gaslighting you, with the Alux app, we're on a mission to help create 1,000 new millionaires, so we're sweetening this deal for you. When you download the app and scan this QR code on screen right now, you'll get 25% off our yearly plan. Hundreds of thousands of successful entrepreneurs, professionals, and ambitious people like you have already made the Alux app a part of their daily routine because it gets results. So download the app today and start building the kind of wealth that nobody can take away from you. Alright, so moving on once again, we're going to talk about a little girl whose dream was to be a billionaire, and she did it, but her success became Silicon Valley's greatest fraud. So by the time she was 19 years old, Elizabeth Holmes had dropped out of Stanford, started a company that seemed straight out of science fiction. Theranos would build a machine called the Edison. So Elizabeth claimed that Edison could diagnose everything from diabetes to HIV and cancer using just a tiny drop of blood. For patients, it promised convenient, affordable health tests. For investors, it promised untold riches. Now, Elizabeth assembled an all-star board of directors, including former U.S. senators, generals, and even former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Now, this gave Theranos credibility, which helped them to land a deal with Walgreens and Safeway to roll out so-called wellness centers featuring the Edison machine. Meanwhile, Elizabeth appeared on the covers of Fortune, Forbes, and Time. Former President Obama even named her a U.S. ambassador for global entrepreneurship, and the press hailed her as the next Steve Jobs, as she often appeared in public dressed in black turtlenecks, mimicking his iconic style. People ate it all up, and eventually big names like Rupert Murdoch and the Walton family poured over $700 million into Theranos, valuing the company at a staggering $9 billion. And since Elizabeth owned about half of that company, that meant she was worth over $4.5 billion herself, making her the youngest self-made female billionaire ever. But here's the catch, okay? The Edison was about as useful as a brick. You see, blood testing requires a bunch of different chemical processes, and trying to fit them all inside a small machine that uses a tiny blood sample is basically impossible. But Elizabeth was a master manipulator. At Theranos, employees were forbidden from discussing their work with their family or even their colleagues. When Elizabeth's engineers told her that her vision was delusional, she fired them on the spot, made them sign a strict non-disclosure agreement, and replaced them with other people who wouldn't complain. When the wellness centers rolled out, most tests weren't even being run on the Edison. They were outsourced to third-party machines made by other companies. And when the Edison was used, it gave dangerously inaccurate results. One patient was told they had HIV when they didn't. Another was told their thyroid levels were normal when they were actually life-threateningly low. These weren't just technical glitches. These were mistakes that could cost lives. And some Theranos employees had had enough. In 2015, a whistleblower from inside Theranos approached the Wall Street Journal, and months later, a bombshell article dropped revealing all of Theranos' lies. Elizabeth tried to paint herself as a misunderstood visionary, famously telling the media, "This is what happens when you work to change things. First, they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and all of a sudden, you change the world." But the facts could not be ignored, okay? When investigations began, regulators discovered that out of the hundreds of tests Theranos claimed to perform, the Edison could only do 12, and the results were wildly inconsistent. In the fallout, Walgreens and Safeway cut ties with Theranos. Investors sued, and Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced to over 11 years behind bars. This story just goes to show that you've got to be careful when the world gets excited about someone. Are they geniuses because of their potential, or because they actually did something? And now for our final story today, let's talk about Enron. Now, at its peak, Enron was the United States' 7th largest corporation and lauded as the country's most innovative company. But in the end, it became one of history's most destructive scams. So, Enron was founded back in 1985 by Kenneth Lay. At first, it was a simple natural gas supplier, but then Lay got into energy futures. So basically, he bought electricity when it was cheap and sold it when it was expensive, and he was really good at it. Lay happened to be a close friend of President George W. Bush, so he leveraged his connections to push for deregulation in the energy industry, and that allowed Enron to expand unchecked, but it also created the perfect conditions for its collapse. So in 1990, Lay hired a man called Jeffrey Skilling, who introduced a controversial accounting method called mark-to-market. So with mark-to-market, if Skilling thought a deal would make $50 million over 10 years, Enron booked it as $50 million in revenue that day. But whether the money actually came in didn't matter. This accounting trick turned Enron into a profit machine. On paper. But really, many of these deals were failing and the actual cash was not coming in. It was blatant accounting fraud, but initially, investors made the company's stock soar. The executives encouraged employees to pour their savings into the stock, but behind closed doors, they were quietly selling their shares, knowing the company would eventually collapse. At its height, Enron's stock was trading at $90 a share, and the company was valued at $60 billion. But that breaking point came in 2001. Journalists and analysts began asking tough questions, like how exactly was Enron making so much money? Why were its financial statements so obscure? And when a whistleblower from inside the company sounded the alarm, Enron's stock plummeted all the way down to $1 in just a few weeks. Investors lost billions. 20,000 employees lost their jobs and retirement savings, and Enron Company filed for bankruptcy, the largest in U.S. history at the time. But the fallout didn't stop there. Enron's accounting firm was found guilty of obstruction of justice for shredding documents related to the scandal. That company also collapsed, taking 85,000 jobs with it. In the end, Lay, the founder of Enron, was convicted of multiple counts of securities fraud, but he died of a heart attack before sentencing. Skilling, the brains behind this fraud, he served 12 years in prison, and Enron's chief financial officer did 6 years. Enron's story is more than just a tale of corporate greed. It's a reminder that in business, the numbers might lie, but the truth always comes out. And here's a fun fact for you. One of Enron's vice presidents was actually Elizabeth Holmes' dad, so apparently fraud runs in the family, I guess. And on that note, we're going to wrap it up here for today. Remember, if you don't have any criminal ambitions, but you're ready to start your own business journey, then come join us in the Alux app, my friend. We'll see you on the inside. Until next time, take care, Aluxer.